Shopify's point-of-sale system helps you sell at every stage of your business. Need a fast and secure way to take payments in person? We've got you covered. How about card readers you can rely on anywhere you sell?
Thanks. Have a good one.
Yep, that too. Want one place to manage all your online and in-person sales? That's kind of our thing. Wherever you sell, businesses that grow with Shopify. Sign up for your $1 a month trial at shopify.com/listen. Shopify.com/listen.
Rabid vampires, alewives with pointy hats, and werewolf psychopomps. All that and more on this bonus episode of Our Fake History. Hit the bonus theme. Hello and welcome to this bonus episode of Our Fake History. You know me, my name is Sebastian Major, and normally this is the podcast where we explore historical myths and try to determine what's fact, what's fiction, and what is such a good story that it simply must be told. But on these bonus episodes, I like to answer questions that have been sent to me by the patrons over on Patreon and by other listeners who have emailed me at ourfakehistory@gmail.com. This past month, I made the rare choice to lean into some seasonal topics. Normally, I don't like doing things that are particularly time-stamped on this show, but I don't know, October got me feeling spooky, so we looked at werewolves and witches. Now, both of those episodes really got a response from listeners. People love their monsters. In particular, the werewolves episode inspired a lot of emails and comments in the Patreon chat. It's awesome. You folks are real werewolf heads. I love it. In fact, I got so many messages that I had to just focus on the ones that I thought were representative of some of the big themes. And it turns out that all of them came from patrons over on Patreon. So if you want to be a patron and be part of these amazing chats and this amazing community that we have, please go to patreon.com/ourfakehistory. Start supporting at any level. Your support means absolutely everything to me. The only reason that this podcast is able to exist is because of the support of the patrons. I love you folks. Thank you again. Okay, let's get to your questions. The first one comes to us from Ariel on Patreon. Ariel writes, "Great topic. I remember reading an article once with a theory that werewolf and vampire stories can both be at least partly explained by big outbreaks of newly virulent rabies viruses. People bit by an animal who then go crazy and act like animals themselves, bite other people, which then spreads the virus. There are lots of other parallels. Night wandering, aversion to strong odors like garlic, even blood remaining liquid unusually long after death." Thanks for that question, Ariel. You are quite correct. There is a theory out there that werewolf and vampire stories are deeply connected to rabies outbreaks that happened at different points in European history. Now, interestingly, this theory was not developed by historians. It was developed by doctors who study rabies. In 1998, a Spanish neurologist named Dr. J. Gomez Alonso published a paper in the medical journal Neurology that made the connection between rabies symptoms and stories of vampirism. Alonso pointed specifically to a vampire panic that swept through Europe in the mid-1700s. In those years, more people than ever were being accused of being vampires, and there's also lots of evidence that corpses were being exhumed and staked through the heart so that they would not return as undead monsters. Dr. Gomez Alonso believes that this panic was deeply connected to a rabies outbreak that affected Hungary and other parts of Central and Eastern Europe in the 1720s. He makes a great point that the symptoms of rabies sound a lot like vampirism and lycanthropy, the condition of being a werewolf. Let's break it down. First of all, rabies tends to affect men more than women. 7 times more men are affected by rabies than women. Accordingly, vampires are almost always depicted as male. Not always, but often. Individuals with rabies tend to be really aggressive, and they sometimes bite people or attempt to bite other people. The key idea in vampire lore is once you are bitten by a vampire, you too will become a vampire. Well, if you are bitten by a person or an animal with rabies, you too will likely get rabies. Rabid people also become averse to strong or surprising stimuli. They don't like strong smells, like a garlic smell. People with rabies often don't like bright lights. And apparently, according to Gomez Alonso, rabid people didn't even like looking at themselves in the mirror. And now I found that really interesting. Gomez Alonso tells us that, quote, a man was not considered rabid if he was able to stand the sight of his own image in a mirror, end quote. Rabid people also tend to be insomniacs who are prone to night wandering. Rabid people also tend to be hypersexual, which connects to the vampire's reputation for being lascivious and seductive. Finally, when a rabid person eventually dies, their blood can remain liquid for some time after. Now, let's say you were a local peasant who was digging up a body to make sure that the person was not actually a vampire. You dig them up and you notice that there's liquid blood coming out of their mouth. Well, this is something that might happen if that person was actually rabid, but it would look like that dead body had just feasted on fresh blood. So, in my humble opinion, I think Dr. Gomez Alonso makes a great case that vampirism and rabies are likely connected. However, his theory does not account for the very long history of vampire stories. It seems very possible that this rabies outbreak may have inspired the vampire panic of the mid-18th century. The experiences with rabid people at that time may very well have shaped all future vampire stories. But vampire legends go back millennia, and not all of them can be neatly connected to a rabies outbreak. Now, why did I not bring this up at all in the Werewolves episode? Well, one of the most surprising things that I learned about werewolves when I was researching that show is that the idea that a werewolf bite is what transforms you into a werewolf is a 20th century idea. I couldn't believe that. That aspect of werewolf lore seems to have been introduced by the 1941 film The Wolfman. Before that point, werewolves were either sorcerers or witches who could transform themselves, or people that possessed magical cloaks or wolf belts, or our guys with that awesome werewolf ointment who could transform themselves once they got gooey with the ointment. And, of course, the very earliest werewolf stories were people who were transformed by the gods. So, while it's possible that real-life cases of what we now call clinical lycanthropy may have, in fact, been people with rabies infections, werewolf lore does not necessarily reflect the experience of rabid people until much, much later in history. So that's why I didn't bring it up. But I am bookmarking the vampire panic of the mid-1700s in my mind because I think that will make a great future episode. Thanks again for the question, Ariel. The next question comes to us from Kyler on Patreon, and Kyler is a longtime fan of this show. She is super dedicated to Our Fake History, so shout out to Kyler. Kyler asks, in this episode, you mentioned that there was at one point a belief that people who claimed to be werewolves were deluding themselves and other people. If they were deluding everyone involved, how did anyone figure out that it was all a delusion? I mean, wouldn't the people who claimed it was a delusion have been deluded themselves? Curious how that puzzle was put together. Thank you, Sebastian. All right, Kyler, thanks for the question. That one made me smile. You are quite correct to point out the strange logic on this one. If the werewolves were deluded into believing they were wolves, and other people were deluded into believing they were wolves, then how did anyone see through these delusions and come to the truth? Well, the people that were making the case that werewolves were deluding themselves and others were reasoning from first principles. They were not people who had become werewolves or who believed they had been deluded by a magical werewolf sorcerer. These tended to be academic types who were making theological and philosophical arguments about the nature of transformation. These folks believed that the only force in the universe that could transform matter from one state to another was God. Their reasoning and understanding of their faith told them that it was not possible for a sorcerer to actually change matter, that is, actually change the flesh of a human being into the flesh of a wolf. But these thinkers did believe that sorcerers or demons could create very convincing illusions. So while they could not actually change matter, they could convince people around them that they could change matter. So this is how they explained werewolves. They're like, look, if you have seen a werewolf or know of someone who has become a werewolf, then that experience was valid. But rest assured, it is theologically impossible for that person to have literally transformed. They were just using magic to create an illusion, and in doing so, they may have even convinced themselves that they were a werewolf. Hopefully that answers your question. Our next comment comes to us from Evan, who is also a patron. Now, Evan wrote me a very long and thoughtful email here, so I'm just going to read it in full because I think Evan makes some great points here. Evan writes, Dear Sebastian, first and foremost, I am absolutely loving the addition of the History of Myths and Mythological Creatures episodes. Keep them coming. I am disappointed you did not spend a few moments on the Egyptian god Anubis. You brought him up and summarily dismissed him with how interesting it was that the jackal-headed god was associated with funerary rites and the border between life and death. I feel it would be a topic worth touching on, if not in a podcast, then in your own personal musings. Anubis, of course, is not a werewolf, but his role as a death god has direct relation to the natural world and how animistic beliefs often served a psychological function under the guise of spirituality and religion. Jackals are scavengers, and if bodies are not buried in a certain manner, they will absolutely be dug up and eaten by jackals. In a similar way to how corvids and vultures are psychopomps in other cultures due to their penchant for consuming the dead, whether because the body was discovered by chance, was left on a battlefield, or was deliberately left out to be consumed as part of a funerary rite, so too did the jackal become a psychopomp in the form of Anubis for the Egyptians. And by the way, everyone, A psychopomp is a god that leads you to the afterlife. It's an amazing word, psychopomp. Evan continues, which brings me to why I think werewolf mythology is a particularly fascinating topic when viewed from the psychology of myth perspective. Humans have always sought to understand, and the way we did that before we had science, in the form we recognize it today, was often through myth and legend. The man-beast hybrid speaks to a fundamental struggle inside us, that quote-unquote beast that lies beneath the thin veneer of civility, as you put it. And I think it took the form of the most feared predators of a given region for that very reason. Because the animal nature of man is so close to the surface, can be so unfathomably brutal, only the most feared predators of the region would fit. I mean, no one has tales of were-bunnies, as far as I know, despite Monty Python's dire warning about their true nature. I also find it interesting how often it was connected to a region's warrior culture early on. The same animal that was propped up as a symbol of battlefield prowess was also feared and used as part of the man-animal hybrid myth. I can't help but wonder if that directly ties to how people may have previously conceived of the mental gymnastics of life before, during, and after war. How, in order to be a warrior, one must tap into that animal nature and unleash it, and then find a way to once again become a man when the battle is done. This may tie into the whole, they walk amongst us and look like men, but are really animals underneath when they remove their symbols of civility and daily life, aka their human clothes. Perhaps the stories also tried to answer the question of what happens to those who have that warrior nature, those people for whom the animal nature is close to the surface, but who lived in places and times where it did not have the room to roam. What happens to a person who is built for war by nature, but lives in a time of peace? They may also have tried to answer the question of what happens when someone cannot become human again when the battle is over. PTSD, perhaps, and what society is supposed to do with that. Obviously, the myth and its function changed as society changed over the centuries. But I think the essence of it, asking fundamental questions about the nature of humanity and how society is to deal with the animalistic side of its inhabitants, is a core tenet. Anyway, just my 2 cents. I love the episode, and I look forward to the next one. Thank you for that amazing email, Evan. I read it in full because I don't think there was much I could really add to that. You said maybe this could inspire some of my own musings. I don't think I could have mused any harder on Anubis than you just did. I really liked your idea that the werewolf myth may have been a way to understand PTSD. You're right to point out that this has been a perennial question for all human societies. What do we do with our warriors once they have returned home from war? There may be a societal anxiety about what warfare does to us psychologically. Now, I'm not sure if we can prove any of these ideas, but they are super fun to talk about. So thank you for that email, Evan. You gave me a lot to chew on there. Today's episode of Our Fake History is being brought to you by Homes.com. If you've ever been in the market for a new home, you know home shopping can be a lot. There's so much you don't know and so much you need to know. What are the neighborhoods like? What are the schools like? Who's the agent who knows the listing or neighborhood best? And why can't all this information just be in one place? Well, now it is on Homes.com. They've got everything you need to know about the listing itself, but even better, they've got comprehensive neighborhood guides and detailed reports about local schools. And their agent directory helps you see the agent's current listings and sales history. Homes.com collaboration tools make it easier than ever to share all this information with your family. It's a whole cul-de-sac of home shopping information all at your fingertips. Homes.com. We've done your homework. Our next question comes to us from Christina. She asks, when did European culture decide that all magic was evil? I've seen some things that suggest that there were moments when only evil magic was bad and some magic was good/harmless. Thanks for that question, Christina. We actually can trace the evolution of European thoughts on magic. You are quite right that throughout the ancient period and the early medieval period in Europe, there was a distinction drawn between black or evil magic and white or good magic. Now, it's sometimes assumed that Christianity was always anti-magic, and the spread of Christianity throughout Europe created this taboo against all forms of magic. But historian John Demos has pointed out that that is not exactly correct. In fact, right up to the 11th century in Europe, good magic was seen as entirely compatible with Christianity. Priests, monks, and other religious professionals were sometimes even purveyors of various magical charms. Not all magic was considered evil. In the medieval period, there was also an elite interest in occult learning and types of white magic that could be found in ancient tomes. But a change came in the late 11th century, which was right around the time the church started to get especially concerned with heresy. We talked in the witchcraft episode about how heresy and witchcraft eventually became conflated. Well, in the late 11th century, you start to see writing from leading theologians saying that all magic comes from the devil, and therefore all magic is evil. Now, anytime you get a big theological change, it tends to take a while for these ideas to filter down to average people. And in this case, it took centuries for average Europeans to get into the idea that all magic was necessarily diabolical. Popular thought on magic seems to have fully shifted by the 1400s, the era that we were discussing in the Malleus Maleficarum episode. But I don't think we should overlook the class element when it comes to European perceptions of magic. Books like the Malleus Maleficarum not only associated evil magic with women, they also associated it with the poor. Magic being done in elite circles was generally considered less offensive than the types of magic that were being done by poor women or peasants in general. So once we get into the 16th century, we see that evil magic is deeply associated with the poor, and of course, specifically with poor women. So this shift took centuries to play out, but it really starts in the late 11th century, then gets juiced in the 1400s, and eventually becomes the way of thinking until the end of the witch panics in the mid-18th century. Our next question comes to us from Hans on Patreon. Hans writes, about alewives, I've seen claims that brewers used pointy hats and that broomsticks were used to stir the brew to signify ale for sale, and then this carried over into witch lore. Sounds a bit too good to be true, but did you come across this story during your research? Thanks for the question, Hans. All right, so At the end of the last episode on the Malleus Maleficarum, I brought up the case of English alewives as the type of women who were pushed out of the trades during the 16th century. I then pointed to the research of historians like Sigrid Bronner, who argue that these economically dislocated and impoverished women were the types of people who were often accused of witchcraft during the great witch panics of the 16th and 17th centuries. I also pointed out that alewives were also slandered in ways that made them seem witch-like. They were accused of being promiscuous, of running dens of iniquity, of using their intoxicating ale to create social ills. Now, in explaining this, I tiptoed up to a potential historical myth, but thankfully I pulled back. The historical myth is that these alewives, or female brewers, wore large conical hats and put out brooms to signify that they had ale for sale. The conical hat was allegedly used to stand out at a fairground or in an outdoor market so people would know where to go to get the beer. The myth goes that the hat and the broomstick that we now associate with the pop culture witch comes from the fashion sense of these English alewives. But this is not true. Experts like Dr. Christina Wade and Tara Nurin have been out there trying to debunk the myth that the pop culture witch got her fashion sense from the English alewife. First, there's no evidence that alewives traditionally wore big pointy hats. The pointy hat that we often associate with the witch was traditionally a piece of Puritan garb. We don't see images with witches wearing hats like that until the late 1700s and early 1800s. Alewives also did not put out broomsticks to let people know that they were selling ale. Now, it's sometimes suggested that maybe they put out a large stick that they would use to stir their brew, and that stick would signify that there was beer for sale. But there isn't really much evidence of that either. As we saw in the Malleus Maleficarum episode, the idea that witches flew on sticks was something that was adapted from earlier folklore about the so-called night flyers, like the Striga. The idea that witches flew on broomsticks had nothing to do with the alewives. And while alewives were slandered as being the kinds of evil, promiscuous women who might very well become witches, there doesn't seem to be a lot of evidence that alewives ended up getting accused of witchcraft during the witchcraft panics. So, the economic dislocation that forced the alewives out of their trade certainly contributed to the witch panics. The slander that was leveled against the alewives also contributed to the social anxiety that made the witch panics possible. But the alewives were not simply transformed into witches. It was not that simple. Great question, Hans. I'm glad I got to flesh out those ideas a little bit more. All right, I think we've got time today for one more question. The next one comes to us from Helga in Minneapolis, Minnesota. She's also a patron. She writes, "Hello. As someone who has been a practicing pagan and witch for nearly 40 years and raised as a German Catholic, this is a topic of deep personal interest to me. Your episode got me wondering how much the stereotypes put forth in the Malleus Maleficarum may have influenced Shakespeare when he wrote the famous Three Witches in Macbeth, and consequently, how much Shakespeare may have influenced popular culture's view of witches ever since. I'm always fascinated by any topic with a nod to magic or the occult. Love your show so much. Keep up the great work." Thanks, Helga. It's awesome that we got a real witch to weigh in on the last episode. I really appreciate your question. So, for those of you that may not be Shakespeare heads, you should know that in the famous play Macbeth, our title character at one point encounters 3 witches known as the Weird Sisters, who make a series of prophecies that Macbeth will at one point become the King of Scotland. He and his wife, Lady Macbeth, become obsessed with these prophecies and eventually decide that they need to act to make them a reality. Now, Shakespeare's witches are kind of fascinating because they are a mashup of a bunch of different witchy traditions. On the one hand, they are very much the kinds of witches that are described in the Malleus Maleficarum. First and foremost, they are women out there trying to do evil in the world. In the very first scene that we get with the witches, they describe some of the mischief they've been making. One of them talks about seeing a sailor's wife who gave her a mean look, and so she uses her powers to sink that sailor's ship while it's at sea. Now, it's quite possible that Shakespeare was familiar with the Malleus Maleficarum, but it's even more likely that he was influenced by a work on witchcraft that was written by the English king, James I, in 1597. This was a work called Demonology. Now, it's hotly debated just how much demonology was inspired by the Malleus Maleficarum, but in it, James doesn't really break much new ground when it comes to the popular understanding of witchcraft. But it's just more likely that Shakespeare would have had access to a book that had been published by King James, who at the time was the King of Scotland, but would eventually become the King of England. But what I find really interesting about Shakespeare's witches is how different they are from the witches found in the Malleus Maleficarum or King James's Demonology. The witches in the Malleus Maleficarum are human women who have been seduced by the devil and have made this pact with Satan. The witches in Macbeth are barely human. In fact, they seem more like evil minor deities. Now, interestingly, that is consistent with the main historical source that Shakespeare likely used as inspiration for his play. The story of Macbeth was adapted from a book called Holinshed's Chronicles, which was a history of the kings of England, Scotland, and Ireland. The encounter with these supernatural creatures is in Holinshed's Chronicle. Holinshed writes, quote, "The common opinion was that these women were either the Weird Sisters, that is, the goddesses of destiny, or else some nymphs or fairies endued with knowledge of prophecy by their necromantical science." End quote. So, in this source, the creatures that he encounters are more like supernatural prophets than they are women in league with Satan. Many have pointed out that these 3 witches with the power of prophecy seem a lot like the 3 fates from Greek mythology. Norse mythology has a very similar set of figures known as the Norns. These are 3 prophetic goddesses who weave the strands of fate for humanity. So Shakespeare's witches seem to be a combination of these prophetic pagan goddess figures with more contemporary ideas about ugly hags who spitefully hurt their neighbors with magic. Now, your question about how influential was Shakespeare's depiction of the witches? The answer is undoubtedly influential. However, as with all of Shakespeare's plays, it took a few centuries for that influence to really take root in culture outside of England. I mean, the scene where the witches dance around the cauldron and throw in all of their strange ingredients, bubble, bubble, toil, and trouble. I don't think you can underestimate just how much that has affected the popular understanding of what witches are. But the influence didn't happen overnight. It would take a few centuries as Shakespeare's plays got elevated onto this pedestal, started to be performed again and again and again. Shakespeare's popularity in the 19th century also clearly added to the influence of his various depictions. So, yes, I would say that Macbeth has shaped our popular understanding of witches, but this didn't happen overnight. It took time. Okay, that's all for this week. Join us again in just 1 week's time when we will explore an all-new historical myth. If you want to get in on our Patreon community, it would mean a lot. Honestly, the support that this show gets from Patreon is the thing that keeps us going. So go to patreon.com/OurFakeHistory if you want to support. I also want to remind everyone that we are going to Greece in 2026, and I am getting so pumped for this trip. We are still looking to fill some spots, so if you are on the fence about maybe coming, maybe not coming, you should do it. Hey, the holidays are coming up. You want to give an amazing gift to the Our Fake History fan in your life? How about send them on a once-in-a-lifetime trip to Greece with yours truly? That would blow their minds. If you want to find out more about our itinerary on that trip, and if you want to book, then please click the link that will be in the show notes, or go to ourfakehistory.com and follow the links to the trip, or go to johnshorestravel.com and look for the upcoming trips. If you decide to book, don't forget to use the promo code OFH so they know that I sent you. I also want to remind everyone that I'm about to purge some of the old designs from the TeePublic store, so go check out teepublic.com/stores/our-fake-history to see what we've got for sale there. A bunch of new designs are going to be coming very soon, including the much asked for Lying Sex Witch t-shirt. If you ever want to get in touch with me, you can always send me an email at ourfakehistory@gmail.com. You can hit me up on Facebook, facebook.com/ourfakehistory. You can find me on Instagram at ourfakehistory. You can find me on TikTok at ourfakehistory. You can find me on Blue Sky at ourfakehistory. I'm out there, people. Just look for Our Fake History. As always, the theme music for the show comes to us from Dirty Church. Check out more from Dirty Church at dirtychurch.bandcamp.com. All the other music you heard on the show today was written and recorded by me. My name is Sebastian Major, and remember, just because it didn't happen doesn't mean it isn't real.
This October, Fear is free on Pluto TV with horror movie collections from Paranormal Activity, The Ring,
You will die in 7 days.
Scream, and From Dusk Till Dawn.
This is my kind of place.
And don't miss the man-made nightmares in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein or the world-ending chaos in 28 Days Later.
Something in the blood.
All the scares, all for free. Pluto TV. Stream now, pay never.